So we kind of get spoiled. We have too much of the same thing. We don't treasure anything any longer because we have it in abundance. It really struck me that, in the past in Tibet, in the good old days, as you heard Indian masters say, Indian masters became enlightened on one dharma. And by becoming enlightened, they knew all dharmas. Whereas the Tibetans tried to master all dharmas and yet failed in their quest to become enlightened. And so it really jarred me in a way that, one teaching should be enough. We should be able to kind of run with that.
My name is Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today our guest is Sean Price. Sean is an English monk who has spent decades sitting with some of the greatest living masters and chasing down rare texts before they disappear. As director of Tibetan Publications for the Tsadra Foundation and the oral interpreter for Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche, he has devoted himself to making the Dharma accessible. In this conversation, Sean speaks about what it truly means to have a relationship with a spiritual teacher, a common mistake on the path of realization, and the unexpected journeys behind preserving wisdom for future generations. I have two additional notes. Towards the end, I mentioned some upcoming transmissions at Shechen Monastery that have since taken place. Rabjam Rinpoche gave oral transmissions, meaning the reading of texts from teacher to student to preserve and transmit the living lineage of a teaching. Rinpoche offered transmissions for texts from the Buddhist masters Tsele Natsok Rangdröl, Ronzo Mahapandita, and Karma Lingpa, as well as some others. When Sean refers to Tsele, he's referring to Tsele Natsok Rangdröl and these recent transmissions. Our conversation takes place outside on the outskirts of Shechen Monastery, so you'll hear the hum of the cafe and city we are situated within. First of all, thank you so much for meeting. You're a practitioner and a translator, and you've spent a lot of time around incredible meditation masters. And I don't know if you're willing to share some of the main people that have really influenced you and guided you.
I guess in a way, we can talk about our spiritual teachers, a root and branch, if you like. And so I think in many ways, of course, our spiritual teachers kind of guide us. But along the way, for example, if we imagine walking from one place to another, like, for example, those wonderful monastics walking from across the United States, they're helped on the way by various people. And so we may have a guide, our spiritual teacher, but along the way there are a lot of others who kind of shape the course of our journey. And so in that way, I would suggest that not only for myself, but generally speaking, every kind of teacher that we encounter, whether they be the teacher of our alphabet or to kind of the person who kind of points out the nature of mind through empowerment or whatever, they're all, in a way, equally as important. But personally, of course, there have been a few individuals that have really provided a lot of impetus for spiritual development. And so I should say, Tsadra Foundation is one of them. Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche is another of them. And my principal teacher, Khenpo Gangshar, of course, without him, then I wouldn't be sitting here. And so those are the main three that I would consider. Of course, if you look at my life as a whole, I received ordination from the Dalai Lama. I was a student at his school of Buddhist philosophy, not a particularly good one, but I stayed there for a few years in Dharamsala. At the time, I was very close to Kyabje Shechen Rinpoche and others, and they also provided a wonderful environment for the ground, if you like, or the basis of spiritual endeavor to thrive. And so I was very close to them and remained, for those who are still alive still, but the majority of them have passed away now. So.
And for many of us that haven't had the good fortune of meeting these masters, will you share a story about each of them or just something that really stays with you about how they are? Because I think it's so helpful to know it's possible.
In a way, every kind of teacher has their own unique kind of flavor. So you think back, for me personally, in the 90s, it was almost the Dalai Lama was just like this, torrent of dharma, this kind of unstoppable, deluge of profundity. And that was, incredibly inspiring to know kind of what's possible. Kyabje Rinpoche, whenever he taught, it was like a lion's roar, not only in terms of profundity, but in terms of his very being. He was a Gilug master brought up in Kham. And so he could really enunciate and project his voice, whether there was a microphone there or not. I remember one time we were at a center in Singapore, I believe, and Rinpoche had arrived in the morning, so it was, I think, the 25th day of according to the lunar calendar, and the people who kindly invited us asked us to join them for a Tsok offering, Ganachakra offering. And they asked Rinpoche just to say kind of hello at the beginning of his time in Singapore. But they hadn't factored that there would be a translator. They just had escaped their mind. And so Rinpoche, they were kind of faffing around, putting the microphone on Rinpoche's table. And Rinpoche said, "Give it to Sean. He needs it. I don't." And I remember distinctly that his voice was louder than mine. And so, again, Rinpoche more often than not would kind of tone his teaching down when addressing like non-Tibetan audience. But in Drepung, where I later studied for a number of years, on occasion he would give teaching there. And later I had the honor to translate for him 6 times when he gave teaching at the Kopan Monastery. It's just, he could just let rip, and it was just this deluge. It was really cool. Quite, but also the presence and the loudness of things was just really special. And so from His Honour Dalai Lama and Kyabje Rinpoche, the main thing that I received was this grounding in what you might call the graduated stages of the path, like the Lamrim or the Tenrim, or how do you like to call it. And that was incredibly useful. And later, quite interestingly, right at the beginning of my spiritual career, if you like, I very much wanted to meet Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche. But the circumstance never kind of came about. Lodge Rinpoche was from the same region of Kham that Rinpoche is from, along with the 16th Karmapa. And for whatever reason, it was only later, in the mid-90s, that I got to come here, and that I met Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche and Matthew Ricard. And Trishul Rinpoche I had met previously in 1991, when I went to a teaching of Kyabje Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche in New York, when His Honour Dalai Lama was giving the Color Chakra teaching. But he obviously sadly passed away, so I never got to see him personally. But Kyabje Rinpoche was his representative, and so it was like meeting. So I always had this wish to meet Rinpoche and Rabjam Rinpoche. But I wanted to learn Tibetan, have a grounding in the Buddhist philosophy before meeting him. So that was very kindly provided by, of course, His Honour Dalai Lama. But in terms of the one who executed that particular activity, it was Gen Losang Gyatsola, the founder and principal of the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics, who was incredibly kind to me, allowing me to join the class. And as I mentioned, I wasn't a particularly gifted student, but nevertheless I was able to learn a little bit of Tibetan there, such that I had some kind of grounding when I met Trishul Rinpoche the second time. So later, when I came to Nepal in 97, and at that time reconnected with Kyabje Trishul Rinpoche, met and started to rely upon as a spiritual teacher Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche, and also Khyentse Rinpoche Yeshe Gyatsen. That all kind of started almost 30 years ago now, when I first came here. And with Trishul Rinpoche, because I knew Tibetan and Rinpoche was extremely kind, then that kind of clicked. Kind of analogy of the hook and the ring come to mind. Rinpoche had a way, not unlike Kyabje Rinpoche, of making the most profound things incredibly simple. So a lot of the time Rinpoche wouldn't say very much, but whatever he would say would be incredibly profound. From the kind of lion, in a way, to the kind of quiet whisper, which carries with it such incredible potency and profundity that is really life-changing. Rabjam Rinpoche is kind of quite similar in a way. Rinpoche is quite reserved, but sometimes when you're speaking to him, he is just like Kyabje Khyentse Rinpoche. I mean, as a person, he's incredibly spacious, incredibly accommodating, and a kindness which is just unbelievable. The things that drive ordinary people like myself up the wall is nothing. But then, when the circumstances are there, Rinpoche just, again, is like this kind of flow of the dharma. So when you look at them as a student, as a disciple, you really can trust that the person that you're relying on is somebody who embodies the dharma. And so the one kind of common thread that runs through all of the people I mentioned is that they really embodied the dharma. There was not the slightest shade or scent or whiff, if you like, of hypocrisy. And so that, even though it may just be one or two kind of words, or not even words, just a casual glance, etc., has a real transformative effect on those of us who have the opportunity or the fortune, if you like, to encounter them. So those are some stories.
So the last 30 years, you've really spent most of your time with Rabjam Rinpoche. It seems like you two obviously have a friendship, but I mean, you spend so much time now translating for him. And I've seen you translate. It's like when you read a Tibetan Pecha or text, it looks like you're reading English. Like you've gotten so in the flow of it or in the groove of it or something. And I wonder too, like how being in the space of a master like that affects you as a translator, like how the blessings of that affect your ability to be such a conduit.
I don't particularly feel I'm gifted as a translator, but I suppose my bottom line over the years is that from my side I can try my best. And I really trust that in the kind of blessing of the teacher and also the lineage. And so when I'm in that situation of having to translate for our teachers, of course it's a great responsibility, first and foremost. And so I just, in a way, my nature is very reserved and shy. But when I kind of step out, then I kind of put on a role, if you like. And that role is completely fueled by the person that I'm translating for. That's the way I perceive the situation in which I find myself. That's what I'm sort of trying to work with, if you like, trying to channel, if you prefer. And so, as I mentioned, if the kind of blessing of the Lama, the lineage is there, then hopefully everything goes well. No guarantees, But also, I have a particular kind of, having for more than 30 years now, tried my best to interpret orally and then to translate books of masters and what have you. I've kind of developed my own outlook or philosophy within which I do feel that there are three things that have to kind of come together. So one is to translate well for a teacher. If a translator is to translate well for a teacher, it's the teacher's responsibility to kind of guide the translator and to make sure that they have everything they need so as to be able to translate well. So for example, if we talk about translating a book, public teaching on a little text, for example, in a way it's the teacher's responsibility to work with the translator to make sure the text is in the hand of the translator. So both have a responsibility. It doesn't mean that the teacher themselves have to jump up and run around, but just to advise where to find it, to discuss what teaching is going to be given before the teaching actually happens, etc. So there's that need to interact from the teacher side with the translator, because the translator is the conduit for the speech of the teacher. And when it comes to the listener, They are viewing the person giving the discourse as either somebody sharing interesting information that they would like to hear. I mean, obviously, they must find it somewhat intriguing because they're there, right? And if on a more profound level, they're listening to guidance from their spiritual guide or teacher, then the role of the translator is even more important because they are the way of communicating with the person who is shaping their life. And so, in a way, somebody who's relying on a translator to communicate with their teacher, that person is the embodiment of their teacher's speech and should be respected as such. And now, when it comes to the translator, you have the responsibility to serve as the conduit of the Dharma. And so this isn't just mere translation. You are giving potentially life-changing information. So you have an ethical responsibility to make sure that what you are saying is 101% the best of your ability to put one thing from one language into another. This takes not only linguistic skills and not only kind of knowledge of the particular subject matter, but also the culture within which both languages are held. The translator, Professor Susan Bassnett, I mentioned linguistic translation, cultural translation, circumstantial translation, etc. So the person who is serving in that way, translator, should know directly and indirectly both of those, such that they can be the perfect conduit. We often hear about, in a way we don't need to use the example, if we're going to put something precious, milk, from the dairy farm to our house, we need a container. We're going to make sure it's clean before we put it in, right? So similarly, one needs to make sure that one's being, if you like, is prepared, is clean, if you like, so as to be able to serve as such a conduit. So this is my kind of general way of looking at the three factors that are needed or kind of make up, if you like, of translation. But of course, this is on a general way, but goes more and more deep, depending upon the teaching that is given. Also in regards kind of preparation, then, this is something that's kind of needed. And so this development of relying upon a translator from everybody's side is something that doesn't come overnight. It's something that is really developed over time, practice, study, contemplative lifestyle, and ultimately through kind of the transformation of one's mind through meditation. So in this spiritual world, and this is really, in my opinion, what's necessary of all three kind of components. So for me, as I mentioned, I try my best to live up to my own kind of outlook or view, if you will. Whether I succeed or not is for you to decide.
So I'm not sure how many books you've published officially, but certainly 3 of them relate to spontaneous song. Saraha and Shabkar and Khenpo Gangshar Wangpo. Why those yogins in particular? And then also just around spontaneous songs. Can you also speak about the medicine of spontaneous song for both the one singing it as well as the one receiving it?
So the reason Khenpo Gangshar and I put together the collected writings of Saraha is because I've long felt that Saraha is, of course, some people argue the most important of the Indian Mahasiddhas. And I think that in that role, he's been long overlooked. So many people kind of claim, in a way, the rights to Saraha, if you can. For example, in Kagyu tradition, we can talk about, the songs of Mahmud gathered by the seventh Dalai Lama that Carl was beautifully rendered into English for us. So there we find some songs of Saraha, and kind of there's the idea that, okay, you're in this collection of Mahmud songs which belongs to Kagyu people, etc. But I did have an experience in 1999, I think it was, 98, 9 time. I had the fortune of staying in Varanasi at the Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. And at the time, I would go to visit Trunguru Rinpoche at his monastery. It's now the kind of beautiful Vajravidya Institute. But at the time, it was a building site. And Rinpoche's house was to the side, and I would often go to visit him. I knew Rinpoche quite well at the time, and I knew through Rinpoche his artist, the great painter Rinpoche. So I would go to visit Rinpoche, and then I would pop in to see Rinpoche. And Rinpoche would often ask me to do jobs for him, to find him certain books. So he would often say, "Okay, Sean, I'd like you to go to the library. And when in the library, I would like you to get Saraha's Song for the Queen. I'm going to South India next week, and I'd like to teach it there." And so I remember going to the Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies library, finding on the microfiche before computers had everything digitized. And Saraha, okay, this came up. Okay, what do we have here? Song for the Queen. Okay, it's in the Dege edition of the Dengyo. And then we have Tatang's edition, which is the easiest one to find. So we pull it out, and it's these beautiful books, which you can open the pages of, and then there's the text. But it's that particular edition of the Dege, Kangyo, Dengyo, both, is quite worn down, and it's a copy of a copy of a copy, which is cleaned up, but, it's still difficult to read, it's not that clear. But that was the only one they had, and so I remember copying it and giving it to Rinpoche, and Rinpoche was like, "Is this the only one they have? Isn't there a clearer one?" Sorry, But that struck a chord with me, and so later, in the early noughties, I started to do some sort of translation work and get some money, and then I would pay for the publication of books. And so I wanted to make Saraha's songs available, because one of the things I wanted to kind of promote, which was maybe a little bit biased, but there is a wonderful Guru Yoga of Saraha, which is in the Terma teachings of Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche, which very few people know about. And so I had the idea to just make a little book. And the first text would be the Guru Yoga, then the 6 famous songs of Saraha, and then a biography by Taranatha. And the idea was that if Kyabje Shechen Rinpoche would give the empowerment and the transmission of the songs, etc., then the practitioner could take this little book. You could go to a mountaintop and you could practice the Guru Yoga of Saraha and read the songs. And if you still required inspiration, you could read his biography. So that was the idea. And so when it came into the orbit of my Dharma friends, Khenpo Gangshar, it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it became then the collected writings of Saraha, both in Tibetan and in Sanskrit, whatever existed. So we put that together in one very large volume. And that was the second project I did with Tsadra. So I got to know them in the mid-noughties. And the first publication we did together was the collected writings of the Khenpo Gangshar, who was the Rukul of Trungpa Rinpoche. And the second was the collected writings of Saraha. I think it was published 2008. So there wasn't a particular feeling of spontaneous songs being something to preserve. It was rather the legacy of Saraha being something that everybody should know about, and it should be available. That was what kind of drove me. And luckily, we had the fortune to not only produce a book of his collected writings, but also 2 volumes of commentaries on those writings by mainly Kagyupa and 1 or 2, I think, Sakyaba scholars. And so all the known, not modern, historical commentaries were put together by a friend of mine, Gelong Tsering of the Tango Monastery, and we published those under the direct guidance of Kyabje Shechen. So we're able to make those available. And with Shabkar, again, there's no kind of real feeling of songs or anything like that, but Shabkar is kind of somebody who, in the late 90s, early noughties, we knew of Shabkar, of course, because of his wonderful Dzogchen book, The Flight of the Garuda. I think that's what most people know him for. But the rest of his writings were not really well known at the time. They were scattered here and there, and a few were published in the Dolpo region, in northern Nepal. A few here and a few there, kind of thing. And so it was our friend and teacher, Matthew Ricard, who really went out of his way to kind of put that collection together. As the saying goes, great minds think alike. Similarly, in Repkong, or in Amdo region of Tibet, there was a bunch of people putting together the writings of Shabkar there as well. Previously, of course, we had the biography and also the kind of autobiography, and then there's the latter part of his life, including his death, that was written by one of his disciples, Khenpo Gangshar. But those were published Kokono, Songo, People's Printing Press. So we had kind of access to them because those days Tibetan books were quite flow quite easily between Tibet and Nepal. And I think even in India there was an offset edition of those biographies made. And so that was a great inspiration for a lot of people. But what else did he write? Do we really know, kind of thing? And then Matthew kind of pulled everything together, and it worked out that we had 14 volumes, of 13, let's say 14 volumes of his writings. So Matthew published those with Shechen Publications. And it was a real kind of groundbreaker, because you really then got to see, how Shabkar viewed the world, what his particular philosophy or outlook, view, if you like, was. And so within those volumes, Matthew encouraged me to read the emanated scripture of Manjushri. And then later, he very much encouraged me to translate that. So it was a project that I began in the late noughties, sometime. But in a way, because it was so inspiring, because Shabkar is somebody in that particular book who is not writing a philosophical discourse. He's not somebody who's writing down pith instructions in a generic way. This book, as I wrote in the introduction, is a testament to the genuine relationship that a spiritual seeker or disciple should have with their guide or guru. It shows that the kind of conversation, the exchange, the interaction that the two should have. Because I believe, and maybe I'm right in this, maybe I'm wrong, I have no idea, but how I was kind of brought up by spiritual teachers is that the student should be open. And the only way you're going to open is through dialogue. And so you see this reflected in Shabkar's writing. The students show up and they say, "Hello, great teacher, how are you? Can you tell me about this?" And then they repeat what they've just said in poetry. Then Shabkar listens to their questions, knows the person in front of him, and then he answers their question. And then he summarizes it as a poem. Not a poem in the traditional kind of poetic sense of English or French, for example, but rather in mnemonic prose, so that it's something you can go away, memorize, and then you've always got that to fall back on, when you're sitting alone in a cave somewhere, And so that's really the way that Shabkar, if you look at his autobiography, which Matthew kindly translated for us, and in the emanated scripture of Manjushri, you find this way of dialogue, or the way of kind of exchange between the teacher and the student. That's the way you get to have a relationship. So if you want to know the person, then there's a whole process of getting to know. So similarly, kind of attending public teaching is one thing, and it can be life-changing, of course. But if you really want to have a relationship with the person who's giving the discourse, you have to go out of your way to develop that. And it takes time and effort, and from both sides in the way. And so this is what I think is very much reflected in the emanated scripture of Manjushri, and also in the autobiography of Shabkar, and others of Shabkar's writings. It's a kind of, in a way, a testament to that kind of relationship, and in a way it's a sign of how things should be if we kind of would like to tread that particular path. And so those were the reasons for those two particular books. When it comes to spiritual songs and what have you, well, I've published quite a lot over the years, and something that struck me in recent times was the discovery of a text which was written by Mipam for the previous Sangye Nyempa. And previous Sangye Nyempa had given teaching on it before he passed away, because he wanted to pass it on. When I discovered that book, I kind of searched for the root text far and wide through 3 or 4 editions of Mipam's writings, and I couldn't find it. In a way, it's not surprising, because the text was written for the young 9th Sangye Nyempa Rinpoche, who was the elder brother of Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche, when he was young. And as he says when he gave the teaching, "This is my life practice." It's 1 page. But that was the core element, if you like, to his spiritual life. And so 9th Nyempa Rinpoche, one of the greatest Kagyupa Lamas in Eastern Tibet, retreat master and guide, if you like, of his younger brother, Kyabje Rinpoche, when he was young. So a very important figure, but the main import of his kind of life was this 1 page. And it wasn't included in the writings, and that kind of made me think. When we look at, for example, in modern times, Kyabje Shechen Rabjam writings, we find there collected pieces of advice, shaldam. Shal means mountain, dam, quintessential instruction. So we find them. And maybe there's 100 pages or maybe 90 pages, or people like that. I think, wow, that's amazing. We can read them and we put them on the side. Nipam probably, in his writings, there's a whole section, so quite a lot of pages. Put them together, we read them, we put them to one side. And we say, that's nice. I wonder if there are any more. And so we kind of get spoiled. We have too much of the same thing. We don't treasure anything any longer because we have it in abundance. And that really struck me when I discovered this text. And some friends and I, we put it nicely and we kind of edited it properly, and we gave it to Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche, gave it to Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche, and asked him to teach it, to look after it, and that kind of thing. It really struck me that, in the past in Tibet, in the good old days, as you heard Indian masters say, Indian masters became enlightened on one dharma. And by becoming enlightened, they knew all dharmas. Whereas the Tibetans tried to master all dharmas and yet failed in their quest to become enlightened. And so it really jarred me in a way that, one teaching should be enough. We should be able to kind of run with that, because we don't need, luckily in a way, as a disciple, we are spared the burden of caring for a big monastery or kind of sitting on a throne giving thousands of empowerments and textual transmissions along with all the bother that comes with that. We don't have to do that. We have leisure to be on our own, and we're endowed with the Dharma and some time. So in a way, we should make use of that. So this was something that was greatly revealed in the reflection upon what the kind of quintessential advice or oral advice was, or rather is, at the time. And so this is something that I think is important, because if a Lama does sing a song spontaneously and somebody writes it down, for that audience, in a way, that is enough to do with the digesting of that, to making it a part of who you are as an individual. That, of course, is personal, but the danger comes is you got one, you need two, you have two, you need four, and so on. And so that's, in a way, detrimental to our own kind of spiritual well-being. If we really want to run with something, it should be one, and everything else should just ornament the one. But that ornamentation process, again, is subjective.
Interesting. I just love the way you put that. They're all ornaments to one. And you've devoted, I don't know how many decades now, to gathering rare texts and printing them. And wondering that process, like, what is the process of finding these rare texts, deciding they're worthwhile to preserve?
One thing that you should know is that whatever you think of me and what I've done with Tibetan books over the years is nothing compared to the efforts of Gene Smith and my teacher, Alexander. These are the giants. And by comparison, I'm just like a kind of tick, And so they're the people that, sadly, Gene's no longer with us, and friend Jake Dalton in the United States, we very much wanted to kind of get Gene to relate his life to us. Sadly, it never happened. And it's such a loss, because his biography, knowing that would be so useful for all of us. Not only Westerners, but Tibetans as well. Because if it wasn't for Gene, outside of Tibet, and in a way inside Tibet, this renaissance of Tibetan literature wouldn't have happened. And for me personally, I knew Gene not as well as, say, Matthew, for example, but I knew him pretty well. Mm-hmm. And he gave a lot of, when I was first started to work preserving and printing of rare books, he gave a lot of advice. Mm-hmm. And it was very, very helpful in the way to look at things. And so I kind of, in a way, I kind of memorize what he told me. Don't ask me to repeat it all, but I try to live by that guideline. And same with Zengor Rinpoche. Zengor Rinpoche told me one time, it's very important that you dedicate your life to locating and preserving rare books. So we're now at a kind of important point in the history. If we're able to serve the Dharma through protecting their books, now there's a hope that it will endure in the future. If we just leave it now, then that hope is gone. And so that's, again, something that Rinpoche mentioned to me, and that I try to use as a guideline for the work which I do. And so, first and foremost, when it comes to printing a book, what's useful? Any publisher has limited funds. What is useful for people? What do people need? Everybody will say, I need this, that, and the other. But then, as a publisher, you have to make a decision. This is useful, that isn't useful. And so for that, one needs to have an overview of knowing what's available, what was available, and as such, you can still get your hands on it, perhaps digitally through Vidyasi or Tsadra websites, or somebody has it in the library that it's not that difficult to get a hold of. Those kind of things are, we don't really need to invest in reproducing them because they're there. So we hear of, great teachers. Patrul Rinpoche, for example. We say, Patrul Rinpoche's writings are available. And Matthew kindly bothered to record all the oral teachings of the great masters of the past. And he wrote Enlightened Vagabond, which was translated into Tibetan and other languages. So then we know about his teachers. So Dokyenzi, what's there? Senka Rinpoche kindly put that collection together. Oh, well, it must have been available earlier. It wasn't. The great-granddaughter of Dokyenzi, Dasalwomo, she, under Senka Rinpoche's direction, gathered and made that available. Rinpoche then printed it. So that tradition survives because somebody bothered to gather it together. And so similarly, when you read in Patrul Rinpoche's writing about his student, Mosho Londok, there's a couple of prayers on Lot's Our House, you may say, but what did he actually write? And we know, for example, if you read Tuku Tundrup's Masters of Meditation and Miracles, he mentions certain writings, certain letters, etc. But other than that, nothing is known. And so then, if we look around, then we find teachings on a lot of unique mind training teachings, very special ways of practicing this and that. Those writings are there, but they're not put in a particular conduit. They're not held together in any way. They're kind of spread out, if you like. If we want them to survive, because the textual transmission, the lung, exists. So if you put everything together and you have it in a book, whether it be a slim paperback or a Tibetan book, it doesn't really make much difference. If it's there, people know it. Then they can ask the transmission. Then, once the transmission is there, the text there, then the thing can survive. Because at the moment, if we just leave everything, nothing is there. You ask about what to choose, for example, Khenpo Gangshar. That was the first project I did. I simply had an interest in Khenpo Gangshar, not because he's from Shechen, not because he's a Sumang Trungpa Rinpoche, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's teacher. I simply was looking through the great translator Eric Bema Kunsang's book, Crystal Cave, and there he translated the most important text of Khenpo Gangshar, which is called, in his translation, Naturally Liberating Whatever You Meet. I liked it, so I wanted to know more about the person. So it was that kind of inquisitiveness that led me to kind of getting texts from Tibet and here and there, pulling all these things together so as to be able to produce an edition of those writings. I often joke with my friends at the Nalanda translation group, Zomang Trungpa Rinpoche's translation group, mainly Larry Mermelstein. I got more of Khenpo Gangshar's text in 30 months than you got in 30 years. But the benefit of that was that we put them together, and then Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche asked his uncle, Radha Chimituku, who lives in London, for one or two of oral transmissions of his guru, Khenpo Gangshar's writings, and Rinpoche had them all. And so, to be frank, I was a little bit skeptical. And then I asked Chimera Rinpoche, how come you happen to have all of these things? And then he told me how Khenpo Gangshar always had two scribes with him. Sometimes he would speak spontaneously and they would write something down. And so the scribes would always keep one copy. And so Chimera Rinpoche then he would, every time he would see his teacher, he would say, can I have, and they would give transmission of it. So he had that interest, and so then Rinpoche received that from him. And we were together in London. There was a few of us. Sewon from Shechen, he was there, and Matthew, and mainly Raja Rinpoche. And in Chimera Rinpoche's disciples, Dr. Mike Stone and his wife Amelia, they were there as well. She's tiny, tiny flat, and he gave the half of the collection there and then half of the hotel Rabjam Rinpoche was staying in. So he received that, and then Rinpoche joked, he said, what a waste of time, what a waste of breath. And then Rinpoche gave the transmission here at the request of Gangshar Tuku's disciples from China. He came all the way just to receive that. Rinpoche himself couldn't come. And then later when Rinpoche went to come, Gangshar Tuku requested it. He gave it there to another 2,000-3,000 people. So now everybody has that transmission. And everybody, well, not everybody, but some people have the books and they read and try to practice Khenpo Gangshar's teaching. So in that way, it's a kind of success. And with that particular book, it's something I think I'm allowed to say I'm a little bit proud of, in the sense that it started out as a small, slim volume of text that Khenpo Gangshar and I put together under the direct guidance of Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche. And Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche kindly taught every text in that collection. And every text in that has been translated. And so in a way, it's a model for success, that every text is translated. I think the last text, which is Mipam's kind of Song of the View of the Great Perfection, is Khenpo Gangshar's commentary. So that isn't translated, but the root text, Khenpo Gangshar's outline, and Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche's commentary, which is based on Khenpo Gangshar's teaching, that's available. Our dear friend Khenpo Gangshar, David, he made that available in one of 3 texts in a beautiful collection, Songs of the View. And so, in a way, that was a kind of benchmark that I don't think we'll ever kind of get to again. But it was something that really did, in a way, have an impact, however small that may be, but nevertheless it's there.
Well, it seems interesting too, like the urgency of printing the text, but then also lining it up with lung so people can actually even read them. I think of the upcoming transmissions with Rinpoche and how the Tsadra Foundation, the foundation you're part of, requested all of these.
Rabjam Rinpoche kindly said to Eric, the president of Tsadra, your work is very important for the preservation of the Dharma, so you produce the books. If I have the empowerments and the all textual transmissions, I'll pass them on. And so that's the kind of working relationship in that kind of preserving the lineages of the Dharma that we try to, in some small way, enact so as to kind of prompt or kind of kindly request Rinpoche to pass on these rare transmissions so that they survive for the next generation. So Tsele's writings is something very important. I mean, in a way, the importance of his writing is reflected in that in India, there were 3 editions produced based on manuscripts from Zonzo Khyentse Chökyi Lodro, Dujin Rinpoche, and the Chatrul Sangye Dorje. So 3 different editions. So they bothered to preserve these books. And more's the point, in terms of Kyabje Dujin Rinpoche and Kyabje Chatrul Sangye Dorje Rinpoche, they requested Jean to reproduce them because they didn't want them to be lost. So it's a very important individual. And of course, in English, we are very fortunate that Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche spoke to Zonzo Khyentse Chökyi Lodro about books and what books he thought were important. And Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche was kind enough to relate that conversation to the master translator Eric Bema-Khonsa. And Eric Bema-Khonsa was kind enough to write it down. And Marcia Tibetan Publications were kind enough to publish books of Tsele's writings within which that conversation is recounted about the importance of these books. So we in the West, we are very fortunate that the main texts of Tsele were translated by Eric. And it's because of him that we know of Tsele. And it's only because of Eric that I got to know of Tsele. And then I looked for the Tibetan. And it just wasn't there. And so with my very close friend and teacher, Khenpo Shidrup Tenzin of Shirigodam Bodh Vihar in Swayambhu, we produced the collected commentaries of Tsele, mainly the 3 that Zonzo Khyentse Chökyi Lodro emphasized to Tulku Urgyen, which is on Mahamudra, Great Perfection, and Bardo. We published that along with his kind of heart advice on the song that he sang before he passed away in 1 volume, and it just went. So then we took the 8 volumes and we extracted all the instructions, including the songs of realization and pieces of advice and so forth. And we put those all together in 2 volumes and again finished. So now we're doing the whole collection because the Gyatso Ningpo's Dharma teachings are very, very popular in the northern part of Nepal, notably the Kunjok Chindu. And so this is very much related with those cycle of teachings. Again, Kyabje Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche kindly gave that whole transmission empowerments oral transmissions and so forth of the famed 6 volumes of Gyaltsen Ningpo. And we were fortunate enough to be there. And at the time you mentioned the empowerments are given based on the writings of Tsele. I have that collection and I'll pass it on once the books are ready. So hopefully in a month or two, this will happen.
So then by then all of these translations will be available.
They're all available now.
Right.
Eric translated them.
I know Eric's, but the collections you just spoke about.
Oh, they're Tibetan. They'll all be available. So for the event, all the texts that Rinpoche will be giving the reading transmissions of and the empowerments for, they'll all be available.
I see.
We produced them all.
Wow.
So Kamalingpa's writings, Rongzomba's writings, Tsele's writings, Shechen Rabjam's writings, they're all available.
Oh my goodness, how incredible. Well, before we close, since I've used so much of your precious time, I'm so delighted everything you've shared is very special, knowing some of the backstory and the ties between them all. And just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share, anything you'd like to leave people with, any advice or whatever is most important to you in this moment, aspirations you have.
Of course, we can all, in terms of aspiration, we all have our own aspiration, which should be along the lines of wishing to awaken for the benefit of all sentient beings. And in a way, there's nothing greater than that. And on the way there too, everybody has their unique part to play. And so as long as the motivation is pure, hopefully the action follows through. And so that's what I try my best to do, but I would like to kind of state to you and your listeners that I'm not a perfect individual. I'm full of mistakes. And so if you see that, please do let me know.
Well, thank you again. And we thank the audience, the crows, and the motorcycles.
Yeah.
And anything else? Anybody else?
When I go, they'll all vanish. They'll be silent.
Well, thank you so much, Sean.
Welcome.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation with Sean Price resonated, you may also be interested in a conversation with Kyabje Gangshar. Kyabje speaks about the grief of losing her teacher of nearly 30 years, what it means to truly receive the Dharma, why most of us are just scratching the surface, and how awareness can change the texture of an ordinary day, and more. You can find the link in the show notes.